at the beginning, I wrote most of Basil and most of Manuel, and Connie wrote most of Sybil and most of Polly. And I found it very interesting because I'd sometimes suggest lines for Sybil and she'd say, no, a woman would never say that. And I'd think, But gradually she started to write more of Basil and I started to write more of Sybil. And then we just kind of cooperated more and more on all the characters. Then the one the two of us loved the most was the Major. We loved this guy who was in his own world. He never quite understood what was going on, but always added his own insane interpretation of it. And Ballard Berkeley, he's no longer with us. I was hugely fond of him. He was a wonderful fellow. And having had a very distinguished career, it was lovely that right towards the end of it, he had this huge hit. But he was like me, he was an insane cricket fan. And when I'd be in the rehearsal room, playing a scene with Sybil, I'd glance over Sybil's shoulder and I'd suddenly see Ballard doing this, which meant that there were 6 Australian wickets down. And I just loved that man. And then the old ladies were absolutely terrific. And it was a very happy group because everybody was very pleased with what they had to do. Nobody was trying to build their part up. Everyone was happy. So that was good. And then each week you'd have some guests in. Getting Connie's character right was not too difficult because she is the sensible one. But she's also Basil's confidant. When he gets in terrible trouble, he will go to Polly and say, this has happened and this is what I have to achieve. And it's terribly useful as a writing device to have somebody once described her as Horatio to Hamlet. It's wonderful to have someone that the protagonist can go to and say, this is what I have just done and this is what I'm going to do next if there's any doubt about what's happening in the plot. She, in the pilot episode, was a philosophy student. And we didn't feel that worked as well as art students, so we re-recorded just a little, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and cut that in to the first episode before it was transmitted to the general public. Sybil, I think, is much, much stronger and more independent than Basil. She could really function perfectly well if Basil buzzed off or fell under a bus. I don't think Basil could. I think he's much more dependent on Sybil, and that's why he's much more frightened of her than she is of him. My little nest of vipers. I always liked that. It was funny, you never really minded the things that Basil said to Sybil because she was never hurt by them. You see, if she'd been hurt by them, then it wouldn't have worked. There's a certain degree of discomfort that people can tolerate in comedy, but they don't want to see anyone in real pain, or at least not in this kind of comedy. Probably not in any kind of comedy. So it was water off a duck's back. She just didn't give a damn. So although the insults were funny, they were fundamentally ineffectual, and that's why we could get away with them. I think that Prue began to develop a laugh, and I think she and I talked about it a bit at one point, because I remember it was... No, deeper than that. And I described it in one script as somebody machine gunning a seal, which is a very good description. But I think that was something, again, we worked on. And that was the delight of going into the shows after we'd done 1 or 2, and we were able to borrow from what the actors and actresses were beginning to create, and we were beginning to incorporate that in the script. Connie and I had a different conception. I can't remember now, through the mists of time, what it was, but we had a different conception of the character from the way Prue played it at the first read-through. And I remember going home and saying to Connie, what do you think about the way Prue's playing it? And her saying, well, it's not what we thought of. And we were a bit worried, and then after about 2 days, we actually saw that what she was doing was better and worked better than the way that we thought it would be played. And so that helped us, because when we came to write the second episode and the rest of them, we began to have her voice in our ear, which we didn't have when we wrote the first one. I'd seen Andrew in a marvellous play by John Mortimer called Habeas Corpus, and he had just made me laugh till I hurt, and I realised how good he was at physical comedy. And so I got him, and this just touched something in him because he's so quiet. He's immensely thoughtful, extraordinarily kind man, very considerate, and that rather quiet, almost introverted. And then you put that moustache on him, and it goes ding, and this energy explodes, and it's something just comes through that you don't normally see. But one of the points I was trying to make with Manuel was not that Manuel was some kind of an idiot or something. That wasn't it at all. What annoyed me when I went into a lot of British hotels and restaurants, particularly one particular chain of steakhouses, is that almost nobody there spoke any English at all. So that the chances of you getting what you ordered were about 1 in 6. And I knew what that was about. That was not about the fact that foreigners were stupid. It was about the fact the owners were not prepared to pay proper salaries, so they got people who were desperate for any kind of work. They did not bother to train them. They did not bother to make sure that they could speak English properly. And that was the fundamental joke about Basil and Manuel, because Manuel is one of the sweetest people. You know, he's always trying to get it right. There's no way you can blame him except that his English is not quite as good as it might be. And that's Basil's fault, because Basil doesn't pay to give him extra, English lessons as he should. He saw Basil as someone who was tremendously class conscious, who was always trying to become a little bit grand, who adopted attitudes of superiority over people that were really quite unjustified, and someone who was fundamentally terrified of his wife. So if you look at the episodes, they're almost all fueled by the fact that he is trying to hide something from Sybil. It's always struck me, and I don't know if the British newspapers carry this out, but people who aren't getting enough sex are fascinated by it, even if the fascination takes the form of being very, very cross that other people are getting some. And that's obviously Basil's problem. I mean, I'm not quite sure when he and Sybil last did it, but it's a very, very long time ago, somewhere around the Second Punic War, I suspect. And the essence of that was all about how disapproving he is and how he tries to catch them at it. And I enjoy very much the degree of how he gets worked up. You know, when people were saying, "I'm not a prude but," which always means I am a prude and it was an exploration of all that stuff. The episode in the first series, it's about Basil's dislike of any kind of sexual behavior at all, and some very, very good lines at the beginning about how people dress. And Basil, as Sybil says, Basil's idea of a really so sexy, attractive man is Earl Haig. And she points out that he did actually wear his decorations, which is quite interesting, because it's all right in your army to have all these brightly coloured things on you, which is an interesting thought. But the key to all that is Basil's utter embarrassment about any kind of talk about emotion, and all his assumptions about what psychotherapy is. Because in the British press still, you constantly see analysis and psychotherapy attacked for what it isn't. It's very strange. I suppose it's very hard for some people who haven't been through it to understand what the process is. And maybe I've been lucky with the therapists that I've had, because there are bad therapists in the same way there are bad plumbers and bad doctors. Because you had a bad doctor doesn't mean necessarily all orthodox medicine is rubbish. The same way, if you've had a bad therapist, as I think Faye Weldon felt that her ex-husband had, it doesn't mean that all therapists and all psychotherapy is useless. But it makes people anxious, because people on the whole do not want to look at themselves. I mean, it's the first lesson in life. There's a small group of people who do want to look at themselves. Most people are pretty uncomfortable about it. And the presence of those two psychiatrists brings out all Basil's fears that somebody might actually start looking into what's going on inside him. Well, you really see what an awful man Basil is, because he has no interest in other human beings as human beings at all. They are either objects of derision and scorn, or an opportunity to improve his position in the social hierarchy. And in this particular case, it's the professional hierarchy. You know, can he get a good recommendation for his hotel? And I love the idea that by having different people arriving and him never quite knowing which one of them was the inspector or not. He would switch from one way of addressing them to another and back again without any kind of consistency, so that you could see really what a bastard he was. I mean, that's the thing about Basil. He's an absolutely awful human being. But the strange thing about comedy is that if an awful character makes people laugh, think of W.C. Fields, people feel affectionate towards him. It's insane, because if they had to sit next to him for 5 minutes at a dinner, they would absolutely not be able to cope with him. They would loathe him. But because he makes them laugh, they think deep down he's all right, and he isn't. When my friends and I started, on the whole, we had a slightly low opinion of catchphrases, because there used to be certain BBC radio comedy shows that consisted entirely of catchphrases. You know, you'd hear the door open and someone would come in and say, "I won't take my coat off, I'm not stopping." You know, they'd be, which would go on for about 4 minutes. When the laugh faded, another door would open and someone would come in and say, "I don't like cauliflower, I prefer the peas." So we got very fed up with it. It seemed to us it was nothing to do with comedy at all. It was some kind of in-joke that people enjoyed simply because they felt part of the in-crowd. It was nothing to do with humour at all. But what happens, of course, is that, of course, dear Manuel says "que" a lot because he's no idea what's going on. It was never intended to be a catchphrase, except what else would he say? Do you see what I mean? But sometimes I think we realise that "I am from Barcelona" kind of got funnier with repetition. But there was almost no intention of creating catchphrases. And oddly enough, the lines that I remember are very frequently not the ones that other people remember. There's a line in the Wizzo Chocolate Factory sketch about Crunchy Frog. There's a line when Inspector Praline says, "Where's the pleasure in that?" And that's a phrase that I often want to say to people when they talk about the fact they've been mountaineering for 4 weeks. I always want to say, "Where is the pleasure in that?" And there's another one which is in the Pet Shop sketch, The Dead Parrot, when I say, I see, I get the picture." And I sometimes think of that, I see, I get the picture. But these are not the phrases that other people pick up. And sometimes I discover that something's become a catchphrase and I didn't even know it. The key to Basil is the snobbery. And therefore we thought that in the first episode, someone who was pretending to be a lord and who wasn't would take advantage of Basil in a particularly endearing way. And Michael Gwynn, who did the part, was not only excellent, he was very funny. He told me about a hotel, or really lodging house he used to stay with. And they had so many signs up, you know, switch the light off, you know, and do this and don't do that and no things allowed here. He realized that if you followed all the signs, if you carried out all the commands issued by the signs, they wouldn't need any staff in the hotel at all. I always remember him saying that. It was a wonderful insight. But that was a very experimental episode, and I remember I was very pleased with the way that it had gone. Connie was very happy with the overall show, but wasn't very happy about a couple of the little bits with her as the philosopher. And I said, "Don't worry, we can read you those. The main thing is we basically got the show right." And one or two of my closest friends who know my work well were very pleased with it and encouraged me a lot, so that I felt that we were all right. We were onto something good. So many people have said to me, "You're going to do any more Fawlty Towers?" And you're up against an expectation. I could not win. If I had to go back now, I think I probably would not do Fierce Creatures. You're up against an expectation that absolutely cannot be matched. And the thing is, do something different. I like working with the same team again and again, because if you have a good team, why break it up? But the fact is, the same team brings the same expectation. Also, trying to make Fawlty Towers work at 90 minutes would be very difficult, because, as I said earlier, you can build it like that for 30 minutes, but if you're in a movie, then there has to be a trough and then another peak, and it doesn't interest me. I had an idea for a plot. I love the idea of Basil being finally invited to Spain to meet Manuel's family and getting to Heathrow and then spending about 14 hours there waiting for the flight, and finally getting on the flight, being furious. And then a terrorist pulls a gun and tries to hijack the plane, and Basil is so angry he overcomes the terrorist. And when the pilot says, we have to fly back to Heathrow, Basil says, no, fly us to Spain or I'll shoot you. Arrives in Spain, immediately arrested, spends the entire holiday in a Spanish jail, is released in time to go back on the plane with Sybil. But it's funny, isn't it? I don't want to do it.